Today it's my pleasure to tell you the story of one of the major developments of Bristol, Tennessee. I am seated on the porch of one of the grand homes that were built in this development many, not quite 100 years ago, but close to that time. You see, when Bristol started, it only had 100 acres. And actually there was some of those cut off before it was over. And the town might have been called landlocked for a long time. It needed to expand. But there were landowners all around it, and none of them didn't seem to be very much of a mind to sell. After the property got pretty valuable, some of them did sell. But this section of Bristol, Tennessee, was a little late in coming compared to some of the others, but not very late. In the beginning, when Bristol was started, this was part of the land of the Reverend James King, for whom our King College here is named. But he had plenty of cultivated land, plenty for which he could cultivate, and he didn't see any reason to clear this up. Thus, for many years, it was left as a forest. The original name of it was Fairmount Forest. First it was Linwood Forest, and then Fairmount Forest, the name given it when they began to develop. Most of it was covered with timber, virgin timber, huge trees. Many of them were cut down and made into lumber that went into some of the early building of this section. Well, the Reverend King, when he made his will, incidentally I have his will in my home, I get it down and read it once in a while, it's written in his own hand, he divided up his land among the children. He had a son, his oldest son, named James, Little Jim, most of people called him. Actually, there were 5 James in a row, so it was a little bit confusing. But Little James King, his son, the firstborn child, his first child rather was a girl, but his firstborn son was James King. He had intended that what is now the great Fairmount development in Bristol, Tennessee, become the grand estate of his son Jim. They even planned that he would build a grand mansion about where Linwood Street runs into Pennsylvania Avenue now. And the name of that mansion was going to be Linwood. Right pretty for a nice big southern home. Well, as the years passed, unfortunately, Little Jim became an alcoholic. His father, very much aware of the fact, was afraid to leave him his inheritance. And so, Little Jim did not inherit an acre of ground from his father, but the Reverend King switched his will and made the will instead to the wife of James and to his children. James didn't marry until he's probably close to 40 years old. He married a lady from down near the racetrack named Buchanan. She was an offspring of the old Ray family that's so prominent in early Bristol history. They had 5 children. And he had a James also, but unfortunately his little James died when he was 5 years old. So only 4 children were left, 2 boys, 2 girls. And one of the daughters never married. But one of the daughters did marry, the second daughter did marry and had several descendants. Well, the land left to the widow and those 4 children. Poor James, Little Jim, was very unhappy about it, but there was nothing he could do about it. His father had set it in stone, so to speak, in the will, and that's the way it was. Little Jim, though, died pretty soon after his father. Well, the father died in 1867. Jim died in 1875. The widow lived on here and did not sell this section of town for a long time. She did sell some that was real close in, towards State Street, McDowell Street, and so on. But she got so little for that it didn't pay her really to sell it. Some of those lots sold for a ridiculous cheap price, like $15 maybe, some of them. But there came a time when it was very evident that Bristol, Tennessee was going to have to expand. There just wasn't room for any more real development. So come into the picture now, Major A.D. Reynolds. Yes, he was of the tobacco family. In fact, he started a tobacco factory here business. That's what he first did when he came here. He came here in the early 1870s. A little later, his brother, R.J. Reynolds, also came to Bristol and entered into the business with him here. And then there was Colonel J.M. Barker, James Madison Barker, who had come to Bristol with hardly the clothes on his back, but somehow had managed to become wealthy in a very short time. Those three men joined together and formed the Fairmount Land Corporation. Well, they knew that the widow of Little Jim King was ready to sell, and so they approached her, made a deal with her, and for this entire Fairmount edition, they gave her almost $20,000. 19 something, I think, is the exact figure. That doesn't seem but a very little nowadays, but in that day and time, it was a sizable fortune. They paid her part down and part through 2 or 3 years later. But it's interesting to note that by wise investment, all of that family, the widow and the 4 children, lived good the rest of their lives. Oh, they had their own business too, in some ways. The widow didn't, but the sons did. The daughter, one daughter who never married, became a college professor and a great artist. Some of her work's in the National Gallery in Washington now. And the other girl married well off, but yet the money that they got for the Fairmount development was what really put them on their feet financially. About 1889, 88, in that vicinity, they laid off the area. Still a forest, most of it, but they laid it off in lots. It was well surveyed, the lots were well numbered, the streets were made wide, and everything was ready for development. They gave Mrs. A.D. Reynolds and Mrs. J.M. Barker, and Mrs. Barker, incidentally, was a niece of the founder of Bristol. She was a Kane, but her mother was an Anderson, a sister to Joe Anderson, who founded the town here. Well, they gave Ms. Barker and Mrs. Reynolds, Mrs. A.D. Reynolds, R.J. wasn't married at the time, but they gave those 2 women the privilege of naming all the streets. They named the streets running in one direction after states, which they happened to like a little bit, and they named the cross streets after their favorite trees. We are right now on the corner of Spruce and Georgia Avenue. Georgia named for the state of Georgia, Spruce named for the tree. It was done in haste because they were getting ready to make the maps, and the map maker was getting impatient, wanting to make the map, and so the girls had to get in with it and start naming them fast. They did it within 2 hours, I've been told, had all the streets out here named. Beginning with Tennessee Avenue next to the railroad and going over to Florida Avenue next to the outer edge. Now, soon after that, they began to sell lots in this development. Wasn't so fast at first, but it became faster and faster as time went along. To make the addition attractive and so that people interested might have a good place to stay, they built a grand hotel out here called the Fairmount Hotel. I wish you could see. I've never found a real picture of it, but I found the architectural drawing. And it is amazing how fancy that building was. That was in the high Victorian area, you know, and everybody tried to outdo everybody else by making a fancier house and fancier furniture. Well, that hotel was something to behold. It was a rambling old building, porches, balconies, oh, you can't imagine what it looked like. That was built, if my book is right, and I think I'm quoting right from my book, about 1887, 88. Colonel Barker, meanwhile, chose one of the lots on Pennsylvania Avenue and built himself a grand house, which still stands today. It sold out of the family a long time, years ago, but it still stands today. I will say that after the Fairmount Hotel burned, and that, I think that's around 1900, he went and took the lot where the hotel was and built another grander home, a fine mansion, which still stands today. Now then, there's a little bit of a mystery right here, but it appears that R.J. Reynolds built a house on the corner of Spruce in Carolina. Most people say that Major Reynolds built it, but I'm pretty sure it was built by his brother, R.J., for he and his mother. But he knew that he was going to move back to North Carolina, and he knew his mother wouldn't live too long, and his plan was that Major A.D. take the house when he did no longer need it. He wasn't satisfied that his brother, as wealthy as they were, was living in a common house on 4th Street, downtown. He said it's not worthy of the family. So he built the grand Queen Anne Victorian-style house that unfortunately burned a few years ago. Partly burned, they tore the rest of it down. But I am of the opinion that he built the house and not Major A.D. People have said it was built about 1904 by Major Reynolds, but there is a brochure advertising this section of town that has a picture of it, and that brochure was put out in 1889. So the house was there, evidently, by 1889. Later, another grand mansion would be erected near the two that made 3 mansions in a row up there. We may later someday show that as a special run again on this Fairmount area. Lot sales became faster and faster as people began to build, and pretty elite, that is, they built nice homes out through here. But I have a map, 1930, showing Georgia Avenue and some of these other avenues. And even then, there were many gaps along the street, lots which had no house on them. I was surprised to see that, really. So many of the grand houses out this way were built in the 1930s. But I, being more or less familiar with architecture, can go along the street and pick them out, the ones that were later and the ones that were first. One of the earliest built was on this street, right up the street here about a block, and I had the privilege of naming it in later years. It became the New Hope Bed and Breakfast. I'm not sure it's still operating now, but it was just a year or two ago. As time passed, it became one of the better sections of Bristol, Virginia, Tennessee. In tracing your land records, you'll find the signature of R.J. Reynolds on many of the old deeds. And he held on to some of his property here as long as he lived. He had enough property here that when he died, his will had to be filed not only in his hometown, but also filed in Bristol, Virginia. I have read his will. It's over in the Bristol, Virginia courthouse. But you who know the town well know these splendid avenues, Georgia, Maryland, Carolina, Florida, Kentucky, and so on, Virginia. They're still nice streets. Oh, there's been some deterioration along some of them, but Georgia especially has remained as a very good place, and there's fine houses on all of them out here. So basically that is the story of the beginning of Fairmount. It is very likely in a later program I will talk some more about some of the grand houses over what I call Millionaire's Corner. Just a block or so from here. If I were out in the street, I could point out several houses that I well know. Up through that, I've been in most of them and know the families and the history of the families that had them. But our time is up, so we'll have to bid you adieu and say that we hope that the best in life is yours until we meet again. Thank you so much for your kind attention today.